Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Wrestling with Reality podcast. I am your co-host, Eric Melikian, joined by our co-host and jack of all trades extraordinaire, Adam Woods. How you doing?
What's good, party people? The exploits of Vince McMahon, holy but Jesus, it is something. But we're going to get into it, folks. But Eric, there's something that you'd like to say to the people?
Yes, basically the views expressed today are for entertainment purposes only. Also, to let everybody know that our individual views don't maybe necessarily express the Wrestling with Reality podcast as a whole, along with our prior and future guests of the podcast.
Yeah, so with that all being said, for those who are not initiated, the things that are going on with Vince McMahon, can do a quick Google search of it. I don't think it needs to be rehashed. A lot of it is graphic. So if you've been in a situation where you have been a victim of predatory behavior in any instance, that's part of Eric's disclaimer here. This is for entertainment. It is of the wrestling space, and that's something that he and I kind of both reside in. But we don't want to offend. We don't want to. This is opinion based and what have you. Yeah, but it is kind of disgusting. I'll start right off the top. Right, obviously, Janelle Grant is placed a lawsuit in against the WWE and Vince McMahon personally. I believe Bruce Pritchard is not. I'm not Bruce Pritchard, but John Laurinaitis, also a co-conspirator. We know that Johnny has essentially Takeshi 6ix9ine and ratted on Vince McMahon and said that he's innocent and all. He was coerced. Which you can believe what you want to believe on that instance, but allegations like this levied against Vince McMahon have existed almost as long as the WWF or E has existed. Period. A lot of people were lambasting Rita Chatterton, and it doesn't age well. There was somebody who said on the shoot interview that she wasn't pretty enough for Vince McMahon to victimize. That is real. You know, um, the WWE has made a Warrior Award, but somehow the kind of misguided ramblings of one Jim Hellwig, aka Warrior, or he legally changed his name to Warrior, right? Where he pretty much lambasts Bobby Heenan for having cancer, it manifested and whatever. All of those videos, some unkind racial remarks and what have you. All of those have been magically scrubbed from the internet right around the same time that WWE, made this award, right? So accusations have been levied against the WWE for as long as Vince Jr. has been at the helm, right? But also the catch 22, right? In the sense that Vince wanted to bring wrestling, which in eras before him, before he took control from his dad, right, and the dais that his dad operated under, Phil Zacco, Gorilla Monsoon, Arnold Scotland, what have you. Um, Vince's vision was to make it a global entity, right, and he ended up making it a publicly traded company, right. But wrestling before was reserved in smoky bingo halls and what have you, right? He wanted to bring it from Backstreet to Main Street. Although it was never really Backstreet because, in the 30s and 40s, during the early advent of radio, people would listen to Gorgeous George. Ed Strangler Lewis had front page news whenever he wrestled at the turn of the century, right? So to say that it was just like it was kind of lowbrow entertainment. There was a time that, pro wrestling was actually drawing better numbers than boxing or any other sport. Here we are, we're recording this on Super Bowl Sunday, right? It was bigger than the Super Bowl. You could name one player on any given team, right? Your local team or whatever. But when Wahoo basically went over, and it's always been that, right? Football players became pro wrestlers, not the other way around, right? So it was never really lowbrow, but I mean, for a kind of Stanford, Connecticut-esque, kind of community, it might have been, right? But the catch-22 is all of the stuff that you did, right, in of yore are not acceptable today, right? So this might have happened in every territory. Same type of predatory behavior, same type of whatever, but not every territory, not every person put themselves front and center like Vince McMahon did his WWF, WWE.
I'm going to chime in here. You're absolutely right. But let's not forget, too, during the golden age of TV, that pro wrestling was a huge thing. You know, the whole Gorgeous George era, like, they were filling arenas. They were on the forefront of television with I Love Lucy, the news, whatever you may have. And pro wrestling has, you know, even on the territory circuit in a lot of the major cities, including LA, New York, you know, Miami, Memphis, they were in big arenas, filling up huge arenas and on the forefront of television since the beginning of time in the modern era, if you want to call it that, or specifically of how we know everything today with media, be television or, you know, whatever it may be covered in newspapers. Like, wrestling's always been at the forefront. It's never been in just smoky bingo halls and, you know, on camp fairgrounds. It's always been a big part of culture in some way.
Yeah, and even at the time of, bingo halls and, fairgrounds, that was this was a day of that time. That was the biggest venue in a town or a county, what have you. That was before the 12,000, 15,000, 17,000 seat arenas. The Armory was the best that, Tampa, Florida had to offer. And they were filling it night after night, night after night, and then going to, different parts of the territory, right? AWA, which doesn't get talked about enough on the pantheon of wrestling history and the importance of it. But I mean, they ran essentially Minnesota, right? Maybe into Canada, maybe into like Montana, but they, and then later Vegas, right? But like they ran a seasonal territory. They only ran the summer months and they only ran Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, and they were making, adjusted for inflation, millions of dollars hand over fist, right? Mean Gene Oakland, Bobby Heenan, Eric Bischoff, Hulk Hogan, Iron Sheik, Ric Flair, Jim Brunzell, Ricky Steamboat. Need I say more? Right? All came from that territory. Billy Robinson, like, come on, right? So who's to say that didn't happen? We've heard about rock and roll Zumhoff, Buck Zumhoff, right? And that's not kind. Billy Jack Haynes, unfortunately, the not to say that the signs are there or what have you, but he was somebody that was in a class action lawsuit for traumatic brain injury, a similar thing that the UFC is currently ongoing now, and it has been for some number of years, right? And that in that lawsuit that Billy Haynes was a plaintiff for, also won Ashley Massaro.
Absolutely. And just to go back to what you said about, you know, wrestling, you know, kind of always having a shady, carny aspect. I mean, it's been since the beginning of time in professional wrestling, and it's still, I guarantee you, lasts to this day. And it's not just professional wrestling. You know, you got TKO on the other side of things with the UFC, and I guarantee you there's a carny aspect with all that too. So, Adam, let's divulge. You just brought up the other allegations concerning Ashley Massaro. Can you divulge in that a bit?
I mean, in hindsight, right, we all owe both Ashley, but also Paul London. Paul London has been, sounding the drum about allegations like this, whether on his own, on shoot interviews with Brian Kendrick, like for the last decade. And everybody just painted him with a brush of he's just bitter. He got fired because he laughed in the promo where Vince died, like all of that stuff. But we owe him a huge apology because, when Ashley died, That, I mean, they weren't together, right? But I mean, they were together at some point, right? He had a one would even argue that he was here around the time, or they were together not too long after the allegations that she levied against Vince and the crew and what happened on the overseas tour, to which, oddly enough, was a tribute to the Troops show, right? And and you're saying just for wrestling. It happens in the NBA. It happens in the NFL. It happens in MLB. It happens. We've heard about Vanessa Guillen, right? Happens in the military too, folks, right? Where the objectification and I don't know, just the of women or victims, because it's not always women. It's just victims, right? That great power comes with great responsibility, and some people take that responsibility way too high, right? And the audacity, right? Because Vince has kind of acted out in plain sight, in plain sight, right? He, WWE storyline. Let's just take the allegations, off the table, right? Because they're very sensitive in nature, right? But Eric, did Vince McMahon on TV with kids watching, right, kiss his mistress Trish Stratus in front of his supposedly comatose wife, right in front of her, 10 feet away?
No,
Did
you're
that
right.
happen?
Pro wrestling has been doing what quote unquote maybe, it's considered very sensitive nowadays as far as, explicit nature of things have been involved in pro wrestling since the beginning of time. It's not just WWE. If you go back to Memphis, like, the stars, Bill Dundee used to bring his wife into storylines where they do interesting things like have her head shaven. And so all this stuff has been going on for a very long time. But you're absolutely correct, Adam. WWE's been doing storylines like that for quite a while.
Yeah, and what my point is that's usually the mark of a predator. That is predatory behavior, right? That's something very similar to Cosby. The allegations of Bill Cosby, right? That he would have Polaroids of his victims and what have you, right? Or watch, at the very least, have somebody just watch him eat curry of all things, right? And they just had to sit there. They couldn't speak. They couldn't whatever. It was in his rider that somebody had to be there to watch him eat curry, right?
But you know what? But I want to mention one other thing. You brought up these, storylines concerning Vince, his wife, and, some of the divas of the past. They do stuff like this in movies all the time. Be it, any movie you see on, the Lifetime network, or so be it. That they do this in Hollywood too. So I'm a little on the fence about including this type of behavior and angles and angle to whatever you may do as far as storyline wise compared to real life, because then we start throwing Hollywood into this, and these are just storylines per se. So to include that into everything, I think that's kind of rough.
Who did Vince sell 52% of shares to?
Would you say?
Who did Vince sell 52% of his super stock to?
TKO.
Ari Emanuel.
No, you're right.
TKO is a terminology just within the last 6 months or what have you, right? But he sold it to Ari, who is the leader of WME Endeavor.
You're right.
Right? Which is the biggest Hollywood talent agency the world over. So Vince, if we're making the comparison to Hollywood, it's Vince himself that wanted to get there. You can't tell me that he literally gave away everything that he had built up, and his father built up, to somebody who he didn't know what he did, where Ari Emanuel got his money from. He got his money from Hollywood, right?
Absolutely.
So with that all being said, you can make the comparisons. The comparisons are there, right? It's exactly true, because we live in a world where Vince McMahon made all of those overtures, right? One would even argue that none of this would have come out if Vince had just kind of kept it close to the vest and either let Stephanie or Shane or whatever succession plan within the family, right? Maybe not even taking it corporate. I mean, public, right? As a publicly traded company, way back when in what 99, 2000, 2001, whatever, early late 90s, early 2000s, right? Like none of this would have been brought to light, right? But here's one thing that we do know, right? There are payoffs. Now, payoffs aren't necessarily an admission of guilt, right? But there's more than enough of them, right? And what happened, right? Where we are, right? The reason why we know the name of Janelle Grant, right, is because Vince signed an agreement, right, and reneged on it, right? That's something similar. That is something similar in terms of his trade and business ethics that he did to Bret Hart. Hey, we're going to give you, go ahead and hear what WCW has to offer, what have you, come back to me. Hey, you know what? We got this 20-year deal for you, blah, 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 whatever. And then goes, you know what, pal? Unfortunately, I can't do it. So go ahead and take the money from WCW. I understand. Right? So all of the things that he is saying, shout out to Ryan. What up, brother? What's going on? But these are things that are prototypical Vince, right? I remember listening to the MLW podcast, right, with Court Bauer and Alex Greenfield, and all, like before there was a Jim Ross podcast or Steve Austin podcast. All of the people that are in the inner circle of the WWE or have drawn money anywhere, that was the closest you got to Vince's inner sanctum, right? And Court, Greenfield, Krista Joseph. There was literally a show on the MLW network called The Writers' Room, and they would take this SmackDown and whatever, and what it was to be in that room with Vince, with Bruce, with Michael Hayes. That's where the doot stuff comes from. Like that originated there, right? And Vince has always loved potty humor. Why? If you listen and read the stuff that Janelle Grant is levying, right, it's not too far from the truth. The Katie Vick storyline is a real thing, right? So again, and the reason why I say is it's predatory behavior, because like if you're a narcissistic sociopath, and I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm not saying that Vince is or isn't or what have you, but with that all being said, there you can draw a line, right? A linear line from his behavior on TV as a villain heel type character. The things that you've heard your favorite wrestler, why weren't they wrestling for the WWE or WWF longer, right? There's a Sportsgate has a interview with Nails of all people. Why did Nails jump Vince, right? Why did Bret Hart jump Vince? Why is Owen Hart dead? Like, there's a line. It's so linear, right? And I'm not saying that he is guilty of anything, right, or not, or what have you. This is not this is America, right, where he has the court of law, right? But the thing of public opinion, right? After all of this, right? Well, you remember how the week started. The week started with the TKO brass, right? Dana White, Ari Emanuel, Vince McMahon, Triple H on Wall Street to ring the bell, the opening bell. That's probably the biggest, echelon that you can get as a publicly traded company, to ring that bell, either on a initial stock offering or something big is happening, right? That's reserved for the creme de la creme. And literally 24 hours later, the world blows up, right? So Vince, I'm not saying I don't feel sorry or whatever, but like he's victimized a lot of people, and I'm not saying that makes him guilty or whatever. But the very thing that they try to do and ring the bell, an opening bell, well, the TKO stock took a dip on this, right? You know, just like Endeavor stock took a hit when Dana White slapped his wife. And UFC and WWE essentially make up TKO. There's no other intellectual property that make up that publicly traded company other than those two brands.
Absolutely. And to go back to your point about, Vince exploiting people, I mean, that's what professional wrestling is in general. Promoters exploit their wrestlers to make a dollar, and then they give a cut of that money to the wrestlers beneath. And it's the same thing, whether it be, NBA basketball, NFL football. It's just how life works in that regard.
Yeah, it happens everywhere, right? Yeah. You can make $1 million for your company and they pay you 30 to 40 grand a year.
Yeah.
Right? But the ironclad agreements, right? That's essentially what, hey, you signed up for this. So don't feel bad. I'm not going to feel bad. I'm going to sleep in my luxury, 3,000 count sheet set or whatever in my palatial estate because you agreed to it. There, but here it is, right? So this is kind of the auspices that Vince McMahon has kind of been safeguarded by, right? Like you notice, okay, here's one thing that everybody isn't talking about. Do you realize, okay, who do you think got Vince out of the steroid trial in the early 90s?
What was the last part you said?
I said, who is the person responsible for getting Vince McMahon out of everything that he's ever been in since, 1980 some odd? I'll give it to you. Jerry McDevitt. Jerry McDevitt has been Vince McMahon and the WWE's lawyer for so long, right? They've, were able to skirt the U.S. government in terms of the steroid trial. They were able to, not pay wrestlers, the royalties for using their image and likeness on the WWE network, right? These are things, right? The Sable stuff, the Brock Lesnar stuff, right? I mean, Brock Lesnar had a lawsuit against Vince McMahon because Vince you prevented him working, right? After his venture in the NFL didn't work, right? Sable sued and came back. They both sued and came back, which crazy enough because Brock Lesnar is one of the alleged co-conspirators in the goings-on of, I guess, the debauchery of Vince McMahon, allegedly, supposedly, right?
So,
but all of these people,
let's
right?
focus that all these are just so far allegations. There's a lot of interesting stuff that has surfaced, and
right.
all these are just allegations so far.
Right, it's allegations, but again, Vince, much like Bill Cosby, much like almost like let's take it out of like a sports context, right? Jeffrey Dahmer, right? Jeffrey Dahmer was doing the stuff everybody knew, right? That there was strange smells coming from the house or whatever, and it's almost like he was poking the bear, like, find me, catch me if you can, and that's a very narcissistic, sociopathic type of behavior, right? And something that is kind of similar, right? Like, who was it that had? Was it Natalia? Natalia had a farting gimmick. Well, we're hearing some poopy stuff, in terms of the allegations, right? Picky James, like all of this stuff, right? And even before this, right? How could you be a kid at a Be a Star campaign, right? And yes, Mark Henry's there and blah, 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 whatever. But what happened with Mark Henry? Oh, they gave him a storyline that, he was, in love with a centenarian and she gave birth to a hen. And that's the type of humor that and behavior that Vince exhibits and has exhibited for as long as he's been in power, right? And and the people around him, right? There have been allegations currently, right? You sent the article to me, Michael Hayes, right, of the Freebirds, right, and a long-standing member of the Vince McMahon kind of inner enclave since what, the mid '90s, right? His days at
Yeah, he
Doc
has.
Hendricks and everything like that. Got another run as the attaché of the Hardy Boys and everything like that. But like, he's been in the inner sanctum. He almost replaced Pat Patterson in terms of like Pat Patterson's influence on Vince. I mean, you could say the same of when Michael PSAs, and he's you know kind of suspended. That's all we know, right? And I feel like the
He
behavior of
suffered
the
a couple
company,
suspensions in the past for a couple different,
yeah,
incidents within the company, which, is out there. If you do a Google search on Michael Hayes being suspended, I know at least two specific instances will come up that,
right. So
don't shine well on the company.
and all of this stuff, if WWE was a privately traded, privately held company, right? None of this stuff would be properly acknowledged unless in a legal context, right? But it's not. When you have an obligation to the shareholders, for how long did we suffer as wrestling fans, right? Seeing piss poor, WWE content, right? And more of it than ever before, right? 3 hour Raw, 2 hour SmackDown, 1 to 90 to 2 hour, 90, 1 hour to 90 minute to 2 hour NXTs, NXT pay-per-views, NXT UK. There was more content that WWE was producing week to week in the last 4 years. I would even say 10 when WWE or Raw went to 3 hours, right? So with that all being said, right, you could hold a lot of that stuff to your chest if you weren't big and bold and brash and braggadocious to it. That's not
Absolutely.
things that Vince was. Genetic jackhammer, big balls, all the stuff. Like you know, there's a promo floating around where Vince and Stephanie were, and I don't know the context, right? But Stephanie in a promo is saying, "Hey, I was only 17, and you took me to those business meetings, and I had to please everyone." Obviously, I'm paraphrasing it, right? But basically, like, she had done sexual favors. Like, Vince had basically pimped out his daughter so he could get a business deal done. And this is being told to you by Stephanie herself, whether it be storyline or not. It's not great, right?
Well, we don't know necessarily what she meant by those words. To say that that's what she meant by saying that, I mean, that's who knows, because of the context of what she said.
I don't know, bro. That's pretty glaring. I mean, why else would you say something like that?
I mean, again, the context. I mean, we could take that any which way, but we don't know
Okay, so
for
if
fact.
it's for entertainment value, who is it entertaining?
Why is there a lot of stuff put out there that is quote unquote supposed to
But
be out there for entertainment?
because I mean,
It's all subjective.
a lot of the writers have said, right, the WWE kind of creative anything has been an audience of one, and who's the one? It's been Vince. You pass or fail. Freddie Prinze Jr. has talked about it. The late great Patrice O'Neill has talked about it. I mean, again, go and listen to. I mean, assuming that they're still around, right? Somewhere in the interwebs. But some of the stuff with Court and all of the writers that were in the room, and they were in the room where the Vince McMahon death storyline happened, and they were in the room where you know the Benoit tragedy happens subsequently after, and to get the natural reactions out of Vince McMahon and the family. And if you believe that to be true, right? That's the way out, right? That's the out that I'm going to give. But if you believe it to be true, the things that are said that have been said about Vince McMahon in a myriad of different ways, whether it be shoot interviews or podcasts or what have you, right? And then the allegations, they do line up. It might be an apples to oranges, but it's still fruit, right? So that's the thing, and I think that's the thing that we are all trying to reconcile with, right? Because if you're a wrestling fan of any, of the last 20, 30, 40 years, right? More likely than not, you were under the guise and the glitz and glamour of WWF, WWE TV, right?
Absolutely.
And that's one thing that Vince was able to do more than ever, right? I don't think he was a booker. I don't think he was a great he was a great promoter, right? They were no longer wrestlers; they were superstars, right? They were larger than life. There's ice cream bars and TV shows and cartoons and T-shirts and everything, like a Led Zeppelin, like a rock star, and those guys and gals that lived that life were living the rock star life, up until they couldn't anymore, right? Um, so that's one of the aside from the aghast, being aghast about what is being alleged, right? But it's having to come to the terms of, like, the thing that you watched when you were young, and help you form your opinions on things, right? And the person that was essentially, you know, the grand master behind all of it wasn't what you thought he was, right? And that's not even from the victim side of things. I think Bret Hart's most recent statements, kind of put how this is, right. Where I used to look at him as a father figure, but also this is the guy who essentially, went on the went back on his word from paying my dad, bought the territory, made one balloon payment, right, and then made no subsequent payment after that. And then my dad got his territory back. Sounds very similar in terms of, and this is what, 30 years between, right? With Janelle Grant. One big balloon payment and renames on the offer after. So that's what I'm saying. It's reconciling that these horrible things, right? Janelle Grant is somebody's sister, daughter, what have you, right? And these horrible things have happened to her, allegedly, right? And, like, well, you wouldn't want that to happen to your daughter. You wouldn't want that to happen to your significant other. You wouldn't want that to happen to any female or anyone in your life that you care about. And this has happened to her, and it's by somebody who you once admired.
Well, again, if like we have talked off air about this, if 50% of these allegations are remotely true, I mean, this is so horrendous. Everything that I've read and seen, and everything that's been thrown out there between this woman and the claims from Ashley Massaro, from Paul London and her family, it's just all this is horrendous. And to me, if any of this is true, this shouldn't be a civil case. This should be a criminal case, because this is to the level of Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby, just so many people.
But I think with the criminal case, right, there's a lot of mitigating factors, right? Like, if some of in the instance of Ashley Massaro, right, and again, we don't know it to be true. Don't know what happened, right? That's an allegation, right? That.
Oh, can I say something, because I wanted to say this earlier about the whole Ashley Massaro thing. It's very interesting. Paul London's come out about some stuff, but didn't she date Matt Hardy for a while as well during this time? I think that's kind of very common knowledge too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how common it is, right? Because I think we're pretty initiated in the wrestling world. I don't know how
it's been talked about over the years too.
Yeah, so in that instance, right, it happened military grounds overseas, right? So there's not a lot that can be done, right? Because you'd have to get you subpoena the military, which could take years, and they'll bury you with litigation. We just saw that pretty recently, within the last what 3 to 5 years, with Vanessa Guillen, right? And she was actually a part of the army and was victimized, and they protected their own. And this is not an anti-military or what have you, but like that's probably why it's not a criminal case, right? And also, if you go to somebody, right, a lawyer of some sort, right, and you're like, here's what I've got, and this is what I want done, right? And the lawyer will be like, actually, what you want to do is civil. You want to hit them in the pockets first, and then, whatever, and then whatever happens out of that, that'll make it stronger for a criminal case, right? And again, we don't know what we know of Janelle, right? Is her friend wanted to get her a job, right? So either she or the friend were living in Vince McMahon's condo complex in Stamford, Connecticut, right? Which we learned about early on, before we don't even know if the Janelle Grant case was the first or second iteration of this similar behavior happening. Because what ousted Vince from the company a year ago, this is even before the TKO merger, by Nick Khan, Triple H and Stephanie, right? There are allegations that were pretty similar, right? We didn't know the full extent of it, but I don't even know if Janelle is the person that got Vince to retire the first time, or if it's another person.
Yeah, we don't know. We just know what's coming to the surface now with these allegations. And one thing I do find a little interesting is the timing of all this. We talked about the TKO, formation a few months ago. Vince, Triple H, Ari Emanuel, everybody at Wall Street, and then this big deal after the new year with WWE Raw going to Netflix, and then a couple days later, all this starting to come out.
Yeah, and again, that is the doing of Vince, right? And how could you not know that any of this stuff was going to come out, right? Like, you're on the greatest stage. Again, Netflix, that's a juggernaut in terms of the streaming, service, right? Even Vince before, right? Like, the way that he got himself back into the company after he was ousted was saying, "Hey, you guys got TV rights coming up. I am not signing a damn thing until I'm back in power." Very narcissistic, sociopathic, right? Because Vince had to know that something of this thing was coming down the pipeline, whether he did it or not, what have you, right? And I almost feel like as the heat got hotter, right, Vince basically did a fire sale where it was top dollar, but when you think about Jess McMahon, who promoted boxing and wrestling, that's Vince's grandfather. When you think about Vince Senior, right? The Capital Wrestling, WWF, WWF, WWE has always been under the reigns of a Vince McMahon or a McMahon family member. Why did that not happen this time? Was the money too good that did you have doubts about your, son-in-law and daughter's ability to control the company?
I'm
I
sure
don't know.
that theory pops up in a lot of people's minds. And let's be honest, at the end of the day, no matter what, up to this point at least, Vince McMahon is worth so much more now than he was a year ago. I mean, seriously, he's worth what, 4 or 5 times the amount he was, in 2022 when he stepped down.
Right. And again, great power comes with great responsibility. So with that all being said, right, he still wanted to come back. Kevin Dunn wanted to come back. Wanted to stay there. until
Well,
they
also, didn't Ari Emanuel talk about right before WrestleMania when they announced that this merger was going to happen, to sell the company, that basically Ari Emanuel said that he can't and will not do this without Vince too? Wasn't that stated publicly?
right, but that was a clause. That was a clause that Vince had in his contract. That was something that Vince's lawyers, and I don't know what part of it, but just much like he had his lawyers draft up when the WWE went corporate. And again, like I'm saying, it's a pattern of behavior, right?
It's
Just
a
like
pattern of behavior, but also Ari Emanuel didn't have to agree to that and could have been sorry. We're not going to.
he saw that. Okay, so
we're talking about here, and this is where this opens up a can of worms. Period.
does it?
There's so many parts to all this that I think in the upcoming months throughout the next year, a lot of things are going to be coming out.
Okay, so I don't know our Emmanuel, right? But I know I don't know. I'm talking about traits, right? So character traits and personality traits or what have you, right? The way that Ari Emanuel acquired the UFC was very similar to how he did the WWE, in the sense UFC 200 was UFC's biggest pay-per-view. It was the 200th UFC, not including the fight nights or whatever, but it was a big number, right? Held at T-Mobile in Las Vegas, right? The same arena where the WrestleMania kickoff happened this past week, right? And that was a big banner year. I've done big business, bigger than any UFC, drawn up pay-per-views, broke all the metrics, right? Broke all the records, right? That was on a Saturday. Monday it was announced that Ari Emanuel and WME Endeavor basically acquired the UFC, right? Okay, so that was 2016. Fast forward to what, 2023? Was it?
2023.
Just last year, right?
This past year.
WrestleMania, 2 nights. That's one thing that the UFC didn't have. 2 nights. Sellout. Broke every attendance record, regionally for the stadium itself, for WrestleMania as a brand, did the highest merch numbers, all that stuff. They pretty much took over LA for a week, right? And all of that. None of it was free. None of it was free, right? And you had people coming from the world over to do it. And what happens, right? Literally Tuesday, right? Because we had the Monday Night Raw, and that was a shit show, right? Usually the Raw after Mania is the thing that people want to see the most, right? It has been for the last decade. You've got the last layover fans from overseas, and they turn it into a raucous occasion and what have you, and it was not that. And then by Tuesday, Ari Emanuel and Vince McMahon are on whatever business channel it was, saying that Ari and Endeavor had acquired the WWE. And specifically, they didn't acquire the WWE as a whole, right? Because if you're a shareholder of the WWE, there's no way that they can do it. What Vince did was his personal shares, which up to that point, he was already selling to fund the XFL, right? But the 52% ownership of the company that Vince had is what he personally sold to Ari Emanuel.
Correct.
Right? And if Ari Emanuel shows the same kind of characteristics as Vince, you pay one payment and you leave. And then it would just go back to the hands of the McMahons, but can't because Vince is there, Stephanie's not there, Shane's not there. There's no McMahon to fucking give it back to. But again, the acquisition of the UFC is very similar to what they did with the WWE, right? Now, admittedly, UFC didn't come with the amount of baggage in Dana White and what have you, or circa 2016, as what they're getting now. The UFC continued to do amazing business, right, in the 4 years or 6 years rather since the beginning of the agreement, right, of the acquisition, right. Literally within a month of TKO, becoming public, which basically means if you own WWE stock or shares before the merger, right, you just got it converted to TKO stock, right, which also encompasses the UFC, right. Well, the stock in both companies, or the company that is the umbrella corporation, fucking dropped. That hurt the UFC too, even more so than Dana White slapping his wife and then having a power slap league.
Yeah, there's, in that whole thing, it's going to be a trickle effect. Now, that's why I bring up what's going to happen over the next, few months to a year. What's going to happen with all these allegations? What kind of can of worms is this opening up? How is this going to affect business for TKO, WWE, even UFC, and potentially professional wrestling as a whole?
Yeah. Ryan brings up a fabulous point, and I'll bring that on screen. These billionaires, the billionaire minds operate on such a different level. Skeletons in everyone's closet. Vince happens to have the wrong fan base and surrounded by weasels. Dana surrounded by more loyalty. Not necessarily, because one thing after the acquisition, Dana White was essentially paying Chuck Liddell, one of his biggest stars, not to fight. And who was the first person on the chopping block whose salary got capped or cut completely was Chuck Liddell, because he was just an ambassador in terms of the UFC brass, the new UFC brass, headed up by Ari Emanuel. It's like, we need to get rid of this, and this happens in every company, right? Where laughs happens, and like, oh, well, you're similar business type models and whatever. Why don't, instead of having two people that do this, why don't we just put it on one and pay them a little bit more, 10% more, right? That happens all the time when things operate. But yes, everybody has skeletons in the closet, right? But not everybody tries to go out and onto Front Street and get big name sponsorships, right? If you worked at, I don't know, you worked a regular job, right, and you're cheating on your wife or your husband, it's not going to make front page news. It might be gossip gossiped about in your community. The people that know people might, kind of thumb their nose at you for doing such a heinous act, right? But it doesn't go, because you didn't make yourself, you know, at a level where everybody could care about, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Vince did. Vince made his community everywhere. You were talking about Hollywood, right? Well, was there or was there not a WWE Studios where Vince tried to capitalize on that? Because he was scorned by The Rock and Austin leaving for Hollywood, right? A WWE Studios that no longer exists, just like the WWF Light Heavyweight Championship or Women's Championship did exist for a time. Again, what I'm saying is there's patterns. There's patterns in Vince, and I'm not saying that he's guilty or not. But if you were to make an argument and like go, were there signs? If you've been watching a Vince McMahon led and produced piece of content over the last 30 years, and you're saying there weren't signs, there's a deep look in the mirror that you need to take.
There are some interesting things the company has done over the years, but I want to first go back to, Ryan Moreno. Big shout out to him. Great friend and supporter of the Wrestling with Reality podcast since the initiation of what we've been doing here. And to basically go back to what he stated, I think there is a lot more loyalty with Dana White surrounding UFC. I mean, take away, his personal things too. I think they're a little more business focused on that end. And I'm guessing from what Ryan's stating is Vince McMahon and that structure has probably been surrounded by a bunch of quote unquote weasels, as he said, people that, who knows, maybe supported his behavior, maybe not, or have at least covered up for him. And to me, that's going to be very interesting over the upcoming months to maybe years here, how all this unfolds.
Yes. I mean, everything remains to be seen, right? Like it's so early on in it. I mean, and even the timestamp on it, it's kind of weird, right? Because we first heard this allegations, last year, about the same time, right? Like December 2022, right? That this was all going on, or was it 23? No, because we're in 24 now. So 2022 is when we first heard rumblings of this. That and look at it, like the rousing kind of speech that Stephanie gave on SmackDown, right after Vince the week before, addressed it, and all it was like, "We'll move on now, together forever," whatever the fuck, right? And then just a week later, no Vince, it's Steph, right? And she's basically like quivering voice. This is her dad after all, right? But she even leaves the fucking company. Like the
Well,
where there's smoke, there's fire.
I mean, there's so many interesting factors since Vince stepped down in 2022. I believe, and this is public knowledge too. I mean, if we're going to go back to 2022, wasn't Stephanie going to either take a leave of absence or exit the company before she came in the picture when Vince stepped down? Because I remember it was thrown out there. And again, I don't know if this is rumor and innuendo, as people would say, but she was deemed by people within the company of being inept as far as her position as a brand ambassador.
Yeah, absolutely. That happened, but also in the, her husband just had I mean, the people that don't know how serious Paul Levesque's situation, the character Triple H, right? Like, he's got a pacemaker. Him and Flair are of the same deal, right? Their hearts essentially gave out, right? Ventricular fibrillation, something of that deal, right? Um, so he's got a pacemaker, you know. Like if anything, we saw in Ric Flair's last match. Those of us who witnessed it, right, wasn't pretty, right? But even like the allegations of Flair, man, like this has run rapid in every instance of pop culture. Your favorite movie star. I mean, read Stairway to Heaven, the Led Zeppelin book, and there's a particular excerpt that has always stuck with me. That there was a waterfront hotel somewhere in Seattle, right? That had one of the pieces of charm to this place was from the balcony of any room, right? You could fish from your room, like literally have your buddy fishing pole, cast it about 20, 30 feet down, and catch a fish right from the comforts of your room. The debauchery that Led Zeppelin got into with that little trope, as told by Stairway to Heaven, it's not great, right? Ted Nugent, it's all for free speech in America, whatever. If I hear that dude go, "Save our children," I'm gonna be like, "You're the guy who married your 16-year-old girlfriend, so you could." Oh no, you became her guardian. You became her guardian so you could marry her, and you point blank told her family, "Hey, she's gonna run off with me anyway. So either you give her a blessing, or she's just gonna end up with me regardless." Right? Christine 16, like it's not pretty, right? If you look at, and obviously contexts are different, right? Like that's what I often wonder, right? Like save our children. Obviously, you don't want anybody to be victimized, especially those who aren't of the mind of the age that can make decisions themselves, right? But if you're of a certain age, ask your grandparents how old they were when they first got married. If if your grandparents are of the time of the Dust Bowl, I know somebody whose grandmother was married at married at 12, had their first kid at 14. You know, and that's rampant in all of like American culture, where that happens, that happened and happens, right? It's a different time. We didn't know that what we know now, right? And so obviously context is key here, but it unfortunately, like, this is where real life has essentially cast a shadow on wrestling, right? Because wrestling, like every form of entertainment, is supposed to be an escape where you could just, turn your brain off, just be, cheer and boo and cheer and what have you, right? Just like every, it's that shut up and play, right? That, you're not supposed to have a social, you know, take on the world because you're just supposed to play basketball or football, right? But the minute that you don't, the minute that you just shut up and play, right? People are like, well, you're supposed to be my kid's role model. Well, what is it? Right? It's the same thing, right? Like, I'm hearing guys like Harvey Whippleman, right? Bruno Lauer and Steve Lombardi, the Brooklyn Brawler, talking about Vince. I was like, it's one thing, Janelle Grant. It's one thing about Bret Hart. It's one thing about other people that have seen and witnessed it, right? And they were sounding the alarm way before Janelle Grant, right? Again, Rita Chatterton, Paul London. Those are some of the people, like, that come to mind that have told us who Vince McMahon is, right? And they were lambasted, right? And they didn't even see the whole thing. When you look at how long Rita was there, look at how long Paul was there. It's a microcosm of time compared to guys like the Undertaker. Undertaker has a podcast. Have you heard him say anything?
I'm not even sure Undertaker's done a podcast since all this.
He's got a podcast.
I know he's got a podcast, but I don't know if he does a podcast.
No, he's not touching it. I guarantee you, there's not one bit of content. You can read the comments. They're like, why aren't you addressing it? Anybody that is chiming in on the comments and doesn't know why Taker, one of Vince's long-serving in-ring locker room generals, is not commenting on it, it's a reason why. It's a reason why. And if they were traveling as closely, I mean, that man might have some skeletons in his own right, So it's best you just plead the fifth.
Well, I think, like I've been emphasizing here, I think the upcoming months here, I think a lot of things might potentially come out. I mean, there's also, it's not rumor and innuendo, but there's also somebody involved somewhere on the chain of command with the current hierarchy or, regime in WWE that had a past when they were involved with Turner with, some similar issues like we're discussing right now. There were a couple lawsuits brought up and everything. And also you hear over the years being in the business things about people that may or may not be in the company currently to this day, where there's some deep stuff, very deep stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, you look at Chuck Austin, that was paralyzed by the Rockers. There's so many things, right, where Vince has skirted it, like it was Vince that's responsible for Owen Hart's death, whether it be Vince McMahon or Vince Russo, right? But pick a Vince, chances are they're the ones who made the call, right? And reading Martha Hart's book, Broken Hearts, it will, man, it's sobering, right? I mean, after reading that book, I took some time off of wrestling, specifically WWF. Wasn't watching the WWF, WWE as much because it is startling, right? So again, this is opinion based, right? But the opinions are coming from things that we've seen and read, right? And again, this is my opinion, right? When there's smoke, there's fire, and there's been smoke for 40 years, right? And it's not just Vince McMahon. How deep are we going to look into it? Vergana ended up killing his, obviously dementia and what have you, but at close to 100, he ended up killing his roommate in a nursing home, right? The alleged Snuka incident with Nancy Argentino that he couldn't even be tried for, because it was already gone, right? He was already gone mentally. But again, every wrestling star, every sports star, everything has had some semblance of allegations levied at him, right? But then you look at another deal, right, on the other side of the spectrum. Actor Jonathan Majors, right? This is just within the last couple of weeks. He was I tried for something, right? And at the very least, court of public opinion, right? He was in a he was in a car with his girlfriend, significant other, and she was acting crazy, allegedly, supposedly. So crazy that he needed to get out of the situation where this guy, fit actor guy, literally leaves the car with the keys in ignition and runs the other way as she's chasing after him, right? And he's the one that gets charged for assault, and it costs him untold millions. He's the reason why. It's the reason why he's no longer in the Marvel or one of those superhero Disney movie thingies. It's the world I don't know. But again, it cost him millions of dollars, right? It happens everywhere. And he was running away. There isn't the storyline where he gets to say, "Oh, I was abusing this girl and whatever, and now art is intimidating." What life is you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Life and art, the whole thing, right? For whatever reason, I can't say the word, but in any event, right? There isn't that behavior, whereas in Vince it is, right? And again, at the very least, court of public opinion, right? There's a segment of people in the world that they just know Hulk Hogan, John Cena, Vince McMahon, whatever, and this Vince McMahon thing, or not even that. Again, I was telling you off air. There was a time where I was driving for Uber before lockdown, right? And they were like, "Oh wow, you're so charismatic." The customer, they're like, "Are you an actor?" And I was like, "No, I cover MMA." They're like, "What's that?" "Oh, the UFC. Like you guys just purchased them like last year." "What's the UFC?" There are people within Endeavor that don't know what the UFC is. Circa 2017, a full calendar year after the acquisition. It was big for the MMA fan base. Wasn't big within the confines of that. They probably had a Brad Pitt movie or whoever else was their client that built the place. They were a multi-million, if not billion-dollar company before the WWE, before the UFC, and they'll probably continue to be. Right? All signs are there. Right? So if you're somebody just reading, I don't know, USA Today or Wall Street Journal, and over the last 40 years, and you just hear 92 scandal, right? Wrestler paralyzed, 99 wrestler dead, 2007 Benoit tragedy, and then here we are in 2024. These Vince McMahon allegations. Fuck all else about wrestling, but those 5 things, and you're just like, all wrestling bad.
And to that population that just knows that, you're absolutely right. And that's why it's going to be very interesting how it's going to affect, WWE, TKO, and professional wrestling in general over the upcoming year or two, or who knows how long. Seriously, because because of all these scandals that broke out in the mid-90s or early 90s, like you were talking about too, that affected the WWE from basically the early 90s when that broke out all the way to the very late 90s.
Yeah. So, and I don't think we've seen the last of heads rolling or allegations levied. So how far is this going to go? How far back are we going to go? And like you were saying, oh, it's going to be a criminal situation. Well, no, because statute of limitations, right? But you can get punitive damages if you have the right lawyer.
Well, I don't know what the statute of limitations is. I'm not a lawyer. I don't
Well, it's
laws
state
in
by
each
state. It,
state,
it all depends on the.
but all this I know, at least from what's coming to the surface, happened between 2019 to, I believe, either 2021 or 2022. So it's been fairly recent.
Right. But if you're Rita Chatterton, right? Vince McMahon paid you, right, to get right before the sale of the company. And again, not saying it's an admission of guilt, but it's something that he didn't want Ari and the rest of the crew to find out. So I don't know. I don't know. I guess my kind of final thought is what I've kind of been saying. When there's smoke, there's fire. There's been a lot of smoke now, and it has already impeded the positive goodwill and momentum that the WWE has carried since in Vince McMahon's absence.
It absolutely has. There's been a lot of twists and turns over the last few weeks in general, and to be honest with you, and this is just opinion based, it's looking pretty bleak at the moment.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. So
bleak. Whether this is all true, 50% true, whether there's no smoke to the fire here will remain to be seen. But either way, these allegations are not good. It's very horrendous. It's awful. It is on the level of Harvey Weinstein. It's on the level of Bill Cosby. I mean, this is bad. And unfortunately, I don't think this is the last we're going to hear about it, or the last of people that are involved in this. Or I have a gut feeling that this is going to bring up other things to the surface, that people are going to come out with other allegations of other things, and other people are going to potentially, I think heads are going to potentially roll, so to speak. I think this is really going to change the face of professional wrestling in the upcoming future. And as a longtime wrestling fan, and as someone who's been in the business, it's a very daunting, dark situation, and it's just so unfortunate. And I hope personally that none of this is true, just for the fact, because I love this business so much. We could talk all day long about the negatives of all this. There's negatives in everything, but as James Beard, who we will have on as a future guest in our podcast, which me and Chris Kloss taped an episode with weeks back. There's a lot of great people in this business too. And unfortunately, these are the people that I feel bad for, because I've met some of the best people that I've met in my life through this business. So I don't want anyone to take away that professional wrestling, the industry, the business, or everything surrounding it is bad. It's just, I think this is a very dark time for professional wrestling. And I think over the upcoming weeks, months, and years, we're gonna find out one way or another the facts to all this, and it's just a very unfortunate situation.
or it's a very positive situation. It's a canary in the coal mine if you have been victimized or felt victimized by Vince McMahon or any of his cohorts. It is the step in the right direction that has been sorely needed for decades if all these allegations believed to be true. So, yeah, it's a glass half empty, a glass half full. So, again, folks, just be safe, love each other, do
No, and
that stuff.
one last thing, Adam, you're right. If these allegations are true, I hope that the victims in this, or any other situation that might come to the surface, I hope justice is served ultimately. And if it is true, I hope these victims get the closure they need at the end of the road, which, I could only imagine how you could get closure in a situation for someone who's truly a victim of what I believe to be true crimes like this. And I hope those that are guilty of committing crimes like this end up facing what they have coming to them.
Absolutely. Eric, where can they keep up with you and all the stuff that you're doing, good sir?
Those that know me know how to find me. I am on Facebook. You can hit me up on Facebook. And also, if anybody is interested, anybody who's been in the wrestling industry that want to come on as a guest to the wrestling podcast, they could either hit up Adam Woods, myself, Chris Kloss, or anybody who's associated with the podcast.
Excellent. And I'm According to Woods. I have my own podcast, as well as I'm one of 3 guests, or hosts rather, of the Wrestling with Reality podcast. You can find my principal podcast on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter, Instagram, and anything else. I'm posting idiot memes of people falling out of trees. So if you're with it, come follow me. But we warmly like to encourage you, much like Ryan has done. And thank you for the positive vibes and energy. Ryan, lots of great points. Keep up the good work. Positive vibe, brothers. Same to you. Good sir. I'm a Ronnie James Dio. Give you the horns. Do not conform. I love it. But be like Ryan, be like Eric, and go ahead and subscribe to the Wrestling with Reality podcast on YouTube. Might even have a Rumble page. So go ahead. All the social medias are there, what have you. I set them up personally, so and we look to continue to create content much like this and more for you guys. Where we're all wrestling with reality. So go ahead and like, share, and subscribe. Tell your friends. Tell even people you don't know. People you don't even like. We don't care. Just have them subscribe. My God. And you guys have a great Super Bowl Sunday. For Eric, for me, for Kloss, we are out.
Thank you, everybody.